So we spoke about genetics. So this is some data that was produced by Henry Chung. He was a PhD here at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. And what Henry's done here is he's looked at key genes, and he's looked at the key genes and their influence on VO2 max, which is our left panel over here, and then on strength, which is the right panel over here. And what he's done is he's taken a series of studies doing a systematic review and meta-analysis. And what he's looking for is the gene type. So if we look at the strength data here, you've got things like ACE, which is the angiotensin converting enzyme, or if we come further down, we've got what is called mTOR, which is recognized actually now to be quite an important gene in terms of the regulation of muscle growth. And then he's looking here at the kind of, does it favor adaptation or does it favor no change or actually a negative response? So the further these plots are to the right of this marker here, which is the 0 response, the greater the adaptive response becomes. So the mean response across all of these studies, across all of the genes here, is an effect size which is in the order of about 1.1 to 1.2. So an effect size which is beyond 0.8, this is using Cohen's D effect size, is considered to be large. So we're saying here there is a large effect in terms of strength based upon these selected genes that he's got here. Remember, these aren't all the genes. These are fundamentally the genes that have been researched in the literature that he was looking at when he compiled this review. But you'll notice that certain genes seem to have quite big effects. So for example, we mentioned mTOR. You can see here, this data here shows a really large effect for mTOR here. And this study is also showing a very large effect for mTOR here. Similar that we're seeing here for these genes. But it's interesting if you look at something like the ACE gene. There's quite a lot of studies that reported ACE, but notice that the effects are much smaller in the majority of these studies for ACE. And we'll come back to why that is in a moment. If we then flip to this panel here, this forest plot, more studies, but again, series of genes, but you'll notice that there are some genes which are in both panels, and the one which really crosses both panels is ACE, which is the angiotensin converting enzyme. Now look at the effect size. The effect size is much larger on VO2 max than it is on strength, and that is because ACE has been more closely attributed to cardiopulmonary, cardiorespiratory adaptations than it has to morphological and strength-based adaptations. We'll notice that mTOR doesn't appear in this list. But one of the genes that of interest is PGC1 alpha, which you see at the bottom here. It's got slightly varied results, but you can see that some of the studies are reporting very, very large effects in terms of the prevalence of the gene. But again, the overall effect is in the region of about 0.8 to 1, so it's perhaps not as powerful in terms of the studies that Henry's reporting here in terms of a genetic effect. But it is fundamentally telling us that genes play a significant role in the degree to which we get biological adaptation. And that's really important. That fundamentally, if an athlete is not genetically endowed, and it's not a case of having the genes, it's the prevalence of the gene and the way in which that gene is activated that fundamentally drives this degree of biological adaptation. So if they're not expressing the genes correctly, they're not going to get the biological adaptation that we want. And that explains why people respond to different types of training as opposed to other types of training. So with that in mind, if we then take this data set here, so what you've got here is, this is a score, this is again from Henry Chung, and what you've got here is we've got the change in the Cooper run score, and then what he's done is he's taken the allele score, so this is the expression of key genes. And what he's looking at is he's looking at the overall sum, so it's an arbitrary unit of the expression of the key alleles. And what you'll see is that following a training intervention period where individuals were asked to do aerobic training, what you see is that the expression of the allele, that is the expression of the gene, the more that is expressed, the greater the biological adaptation is in terms of Cooper run performance, the distance that they completed. So that's really important because it's telling us it's not about having the gene, it's the allele, which is basically the best way to think about an allele. If you think, I'm not sure what you mean, an allele is kind of the fact we've all got the genes that generally all of us got the genes that give us eyesight and give us our eyes and our basic eye function. But we have this notion of red eyes, not red eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, and that is really down to what we call the XX, the XY, and the YY chromosomic representation. That is the allele score. Excuse me. So what that fundamentally means is, depending upon how the gene is expressed, determines, in that case, what colour eyes you've got. This is basically saying how the genes are expressed in relation to aerobically orientated genes. The more that they're expressed, let's say positively, the greater the adaptation is in terms of Cooper run performance. So it's really showing us that there is an association between genes and biological adaptation. Now, with that in mind, let's just go and think about this a little bit more, which comes back to that schematic, which was recognising, yes, we've got genetic factors, but one of the things was that notion of trainability. So this is a data set that was published by our group here at Anglia Ruskin in Cambridge a number of years ago, 2019. And what we've got is, this is a quite a simple study. It's a 4-week intervention of either doing high intensity training, so this is kind of sprint interval training, which you can see here, 10 times 20 seconds at 170% VO2 max, or continuous based training, which was basically 3 times 30 minutes at around about 70% of VO2 max, or basically doing no training over the same period. And then what's been measured is the pre to post response in VO2 max. And what is interesting is, if we look at the solid line in the sprint interval training group here, we can see VO2 max has gone up. It was actually not considered to be non-significant. We can also see in our continuous training group that we got a relatively similar response for VO2 max over that same period of time. And in the continuous training group, there was almost no change. I mean, it's gone down a little bit, there's almost no change, but none of these groups showed a significant response. But that's not the important take-home message. The important take-home message is, have a look within any of these data sets, particularly Group A, which is the sprint interval, and Group B, which is the continuous training. And what you'll notice is the high degree of variability in the level of response. So, for example, this individual here has had an enormous response, going up from about 40 to 55 millilitres per kilogram per minute over a 4-week training period. Whereas this individual has gone from 65 and has actually had a decrease. This individual has had a decrease. This individual has had a relatively small increase. So there's huge degrees of variability. The same you can see here in the continuous training group as well. So this really comes down to that notion of trainability, and trainability being linked almost certainly to genetic representation, the expression of those genes. And that's a really important take-home message, which is, although through the course of these presentations and the course of the information presented through this playlist, we'll be dealing with the idea of positive adaptations to training, and we'll be showing data for this. You have to remember that there are always going to be individualised responses. That's why we have to show in studies, for example, either do show the individual responses. I think this is a very positive way of representing data. Or one of the things we might do is just show simple responses using things like the average with the standard deviation, for example. So we can see that there are individual responses to training represented by the high degree of variability. So people don't respond to the same degree. And that's really summarised here quite nicely by this data set that was published a while back now. But what you can see in this data set, and this is kind of from Claude Bouchard's group, so this is kind of a highly respected group. But what you can see is we've got changes. It's the delta change in VO2 max. And what they've got here is they've got it across the different groups. Doesn't matter which group you're really interested in, whether it's A, B, C or D. And what they've done is they've ordered the data basically in the degree to which they have responded. So in the degree in which they've got the change in the mils per minute score. And what you can see, irrespective of which one you're looking at, is how variable the data is. Okay, how variable the data is. So this kind of, it's kind of like a histogram, isn't it? But rather than having it kind of on a bell curve, they've ordered it in terms of the number of participants going this way, and then the degree of adaptation against the degree of adaptation. And you can see that it's very, very variable. You've got some individuals that produce really big responses, but there are some individuals that produce negative responses or almost marginally no response at all. Now this is really important because there's a whole slew of literature which refers to the notion of negative responders. There is no such thing as a negative responder. Let's put that out there. A negative responder means fundamentally that, well, what is a negative response? Well, a negative response is the opposite to a positive response. Well, you go, well, that's negative, surely. But negative is a slightly detrimental term. They have responded, haven't they? There is a biological response. A negative response really would be no response at all, I would argue. They've got a response that's gone in the opposite direction that one would expect it. Doesn't mean they haven't responded, but they have responded differently. But they have still responded to training. And we need to understand why that is the case. Why do some people respond differently? And one of the key aspects in that is clearly genetics. But there are clearly also socioeconomic factors that relate to this. There are clearly also factors related to competing influences on our life. So it might be diet-based, it might be health-based, it might be injury-based, all those things that we saw in that schematic to start with. But this really, again, alludes to the notion of the individuality in terms of training-based responses. That yes, we are going to talk about training as being kind of a very positive response, but huge degrees of variability in the way people respond to the same training stimulus. And if we then look at this data here, and this again is from data from Henry Chung, and what you can see is he's got the same approach. This is the average response over the training period for the Cooper Run data. So what you can see is he's done it in kind of in a different way, but you can see this is the average response. So actually, of the 17 participants, just over half of them actually were in excess of the average response, which is a mean delta response of 0.26 kilometres. It's about 250, just over 250 metre difference pre to post intervention. But there's this whole slew of participants here who either didn't meet that or, as this one here, actually got worse. So you're seeing that reinforcement of that variability in the training response, that we do not all exhibit the same degree of adaptation. And we have to recognise that both as physiologists and sports scientists, but also particularly when we're working clinically and working even as personal trainers, and understanding that people's responses will not be the same. Although we can talk about typical responses for strength training being, 8 to 12 weeks before we start to see morphological adaptations, it will actually be, for some people, yes, 8 to 12 weeks, but some people you might see it in 6 weeks, some people it might take 16 weeks. It's that variability that we just need to be cognizant of. So if we now park that kind of degree of genetics and variability and trainability, let's start to now think about some of the ways in which we respond and some of the understanding that we have in terms of time courses of adaptation. So this is taken from a paper published a while back now in 2003 in Sports Medicine, but it's got a really nice paragraph which relates to the image that you've got on the slide here. So in the image on the slide, what they've got is they've followed an athlete across about a 16-year period, and this is an athlete who is a swimmer, and what they're showing is the progression over time. And you can see in the first few years there's perhaps no real progression. They haven't really recorded data. From about age 14, there's a very, very significant acceleration throughout this time period. And then what they've mapped is 3 successive Olympic Games, 92, 96 and 2000. And you can see that from 14 to 16, 17, there's a very rapid progression. But then notice that the degree of progression, there's obviously a downturn after this Olympic here. But look at the slope. The degree of adaptation becomes much, much slower. And in fact, it starts to slow down very, very significantly. So it's quite interesting that they are still improving, but it gets harder and harder to improve. Now that then relates to what is written in this paragraph here, which is this. A substantial body of evidence also suggests that elite performance requires around 10 years of practice to acquire the necessary skills and experience to perform at an international level, which kind of fits with what you see here, right? This is about 14 to 26, so it's within that kind of 10-year period. 9 years would appear to be a watershed in sports such as soccer and field hockey. So in other words, it seems to be that it's going to take us around about 10 years to work with an athlete to be able to produce the optimal results. So that's kind of, it seems to be what they're suggesting, is this kind of window of opportunity that you have to work within. And we can reinforce that a little bit. So there's a couple of data sets that you've got here. So here we've got performance. This is taken from Ericsson. Again, it's a relatively old paper, but it's really useful for us. We've got performance on our y-axis and we've got age here. And here we've got our 10-year period from 10 to 20 years. And you can see that is where, in terms of performance, they get the greatest degree of performance gain. That's the key. They're still improving, but that's that 10-year period where the biggest adaptations are taking place. In this data set here, what you've got is you've got estimated accumulated practice hours. And what you can see is the age in this case is in musicians, and you might get a hint of where this is going. But you can see fundamentally the kind of the progression, that what we start to see is that depending upon the practice hours, you get an accumulated gain in terms of performance. So what is this really telling us? Well, it's this. The most compelling evidence for the role of vast experience and expertise comes from investigators who have shown that even for the most talented individuals, 10 years of experience is in a domain, the 10-year rule, is necessary to become an expert. Let's pause. So 10 years to become an expert, 10 years to attain peak performance. But do we think that is really the case? Do we think that's really genuinely the case? And the hint really is, this is from musicians. Ask yourself what this data is related to here. Well, actually, the evidence for the 10-year rule is almost non-existent within sport. The 10-year rule actually only seems to have been evidenced in things like musicians reading and playing chess. The 10-year rule doesn't exist. And so, please don't fall into that trap of thinking, oh, it's fundamental, it takes 10 years. It doesn't. There are athletes we get into early specialisation sports. So, for example, sports like gymnastics. A typical Olympic gymnast can be from 14 to 16 years of age. I think they've set the upper limit now, so the lower limit now of 16 years of age. But fundamentally, they will start gymnastics training about the age of 4 to 6 years of age. We know that tennis, particularly on the female side of the game, the competitive age is getting younger and younger. It doesn't fit with that notion of a 10-year rule. But if you then go with something like marathon running actually is much more associated with accrued volume of training, actually a large amount of work. Most successful endurance athletes, there are every exception to the rule, but if you look at most successful endurance athletes, they're much older. They're into their mid to late 20s. It's not that they started training in the early 20s, but they've accrued training over probably a 20-year period, 15 to 20-year period. Doesn't fit with the 10-year rule. Doesn't exist. So don't fall into that trap. It's one of these great misnomers, and it's kind of something that you really need to challenge and move beyond.